All right. You ready to get going? It says never begin any great undertaking without the word of prayer. Gracious God, in times of division and struggle, conflict and confusion, we turn to you. You don't always give us the answers, but you always guide us to patience, to understanding, and to hope in this hour. Well, 45 minutes. Guide us, lead us, make us to see the light. In Jesus' name, amen. So we are going to be discussing controversial topics. If you want to get mad at me, save it till after we're done. It's just a challenge. We're talking about something that's dividing our church and, in reality, much of our society, and so we need to go. The state of the United Methodist Church probably wouldn't have predicted it would have gotten to this point even 6 years ago, and yet it kind of exploded. And as with everything else, it's easy to blame COVID because it's COVID's fault. It exacerbated a problem that's been there for a long time. So I'm going to try to use this and see how this goes. Come on, baby. There it is. Little history. The Methodist Episcopal Church was founded in response to the American Revolution because being Church of England wasn't very appealing after we'd won. So the Methodists, who were societies and a part of the Episcopal or Church of England, decided, well, we needed our own church. John Wesley sent us Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury as bishops to lead the church, and all those little congregations all over the countryside began to take off. Methodist societies were really popular because of the community that they fostered and the support that they fostered. So especially in pioneer frontier areas, which was Appalachia at the time, there were a lot of little churches. And they started, ordaining clergy. And those clergy then would serve as circuit riders in large numbers of churches. After a time, it was decided we needed a set of rules. And we had a general conference almost the same time as they were approving the United States Constitution, which was after the Articles of Confederation, you all remember. So, not surprisingly then, the United Methodist Church is modeled very much on the system of the United States government. We have a legislative body, which is the General Conference that meets every 4 years. They propose and approve legislation. We have a judicial branch, which is the Judicial Council, which meets to address issues on a regular basis. And then we have an executive branch, but not in one person, but in the episcopacy and the bishops. The bishops get to decide things and run the show. Originally, they were more bureaucrats or managers than they are now. But that's just my opinion. So we have this system. It's going along swimmingly, except for the issue of slavery, which was dividing the whole country. The church split into the Methodist Episcopal North and the Methodist Episcopal South over the issue of slavery and the Civil War, and they stayed separated for quite a while after the war, eventually sort of reunion. But there's still senses of division, and especially if you go in the Deep South and the old Confederacy, there's a sense of separation on a lot of issues, and it's come up again in this issue. The other group that gets brought in is the Evangelical United Brethren, which is a joining of the United Brethren and the Evangelical Brethren, German-speaking congregations who follow the Wesleyan Methodist, Wesleyan system, except they were German-speaking. So if you went to one of those, there's a good chance that 50, 100 years ago, they were still using German in worship. But as that faded away, we realized that we're the same group, we're just doing it in different buildings. So in 1968, they joined the EUB with the Methodist Episcopal and became United Methodists. All right? Trying to get through that stuff fast. So we maintain the structure. The church is separated into geographical areas, annual conferences. Annual conferences meet on an annual basis, as you see. Their primary job is to oversee the clergy in the churches in their geographical area and to ordain clergy within that area. We have one bishop that oversees each annual conference. Well, no, one bishop might oversee more than one geographical area, one annual conference, but it's their job to be the manager, the boss, and kind of keep us in line. And decide a lot of stuff. It's an impossible job. Under bishops are district superintendents. You're part of the Utah Western District, and boundaries change slightly. If you were to go back east, an entire district might compromise one or two towns because there's much higher population density. Out here, you get whole states because we're just not that thick. So, but then thus the district superintendents who serve for a period of time helping the bishop, and that's the cabinet, make decisions about clergy appointments and other bits of nonsense and spending money. The Book of Discipline. So they originally came up with the Book of Discipline. This is our Constitution. This is where all the rules are. It came out of the early church and a desire to have things written down so that people could use them. We are Methodists for a reason. We're very methodical. And it's a paragraph-based system, and it's really thick now. I should have brought one in. But it's edited on a quarterly, quadrennial basis. Every 4 years, they gather in the General Conference, and there's where proposals for editing the Book of Discipline are brought and either approved or disapproved by a vote of the body. Then if it's felt that it's out of order, it can be challenged in the court, and the judicial council can rule on that, and they do that twice a year. Can't read my own notes. Trust clause. Okay, starts getting ugly. In the United Methodist system, there's what's known as the trust clause. You do not own this building. As a congregation, you don't own it. It's held in trust for the conference. The annual conference owns the building. If you had a parsonage, they would own your parsonage. So that's a very important consideration as we start to move through this process. You don't own it. And so to get your building out of the United Methodist system, well, that gets kind of tricky. I should get my notes. Paragraph 304.3 states that no self-avowed and practicing homosexual is to be ordained a clergy. And the next paragraph is about performing marriages, same-sex marriages. No clergy are allowed to perform same-sex marriages. Those have been in place since the 70s when the issue started to crop up. And before that, we just didn't talk about it. It was like the military. Everyone was don't ask, don't tell. And then it started to show up and be more prevalent. We'll talk about that. There's some other paragraphs in there that say you can't use funding for support of gay rights. You can't use funding to promote any kind of homosexual programs, that kind of stuff. Questions so far? Yes, sir. What about the what?
Worldwide church. You talked about the U.S.
Oh, the worldwide church, yeah. So that's where the problem comes in. The United Methodist Church is in the United States primarily, but there's also a United Methodist Church in a couple places in Africa and in the Philippines are the other two places. It used to be we had this very interesting system where they were all kind of second-class citizens in the voting process. And then also in the 70s we said, well, no, they're not United Methodists just like us. They should be given full and equal votes. And that upset the apple cart. But yes, there are. There's also the British Methodist Church, which isn't United Methodist. That's in Britain, a couple places in Africa, and then in the Central America. And which brings us to the World Methodist Council, which you don't want to know about. They don't do anything. Homosexuality in the Bible. Leviticus 18:20 says, if a man lies with a man as with a woman, it is an abomination. They should be put to death. Well, that's not very nice. Pretty clear. Same thing in Leviticus 20. You should be put to death. In Romans, Paul talks about giving over to unnatural passions. And there's some question on the Greek translation of the words that are used in there, but it's still pretty much a prescription. Corinthians is a litany of bad behaviors, from fornication to debauchery to drunkenness to licentiousness, and then the issue of homosexuality crops in. Where does this stuff come from? It was obviously a very important issue in the early days of the Jewish tradition. And there are a lot of other laws about sexual behavior in Leviticus because procreation was absolutely central. You did not want people not having babies because you needed as many of the little buggers as you could churn out. And the death rate on children was high and the mortality, and you wanted, so it was a sin to waste. The concept was that a male sperm was a whole being, and it was planted in the woman, and she was just the vessel holding it. So you didn't want to waste that at all because it was a whole being. It would be like committing an abortion. So, different way of understanding the world in those days. But the other culture clash comes in the first century when Paul is writing in the early church. Now, the Romans highly admired the Greek culture. And so they modeled a bunch of things on the Greeks, and they liked them a lot. But the Greeks had some strange proclivities. They liked running around naked. They liked doing their sports naked. They had relationships that, as the Jewish culture saw it, were unnatural and inappropriate. Their temples frequently involved temple prostitution as a way of earning favor with the gods. They had a system where young men, and specifically in Sparta, but also in Athens, where young men were set to be tutored by an adult male. And they would work together and they would fight together ultimately after they had been trained. And so that relationship was meant to foster that strength, that bond of two people who have worked and grown together. In occasional instances, it was a homosexual relationship, but certainly not all of them. And so what the problem was is that a lot of Greeks were coming into the area of Palestine, Israel, and the Jews have read Leviticus. There's a long list of rules about what you're not supposed to do. So if you want to just pick out Leviticus 18 and 20, you got to do the other one on not eating shellfish, not eating pork, bacon's out the window. You got to go through the whole, there's a lot of stuff you're not supposed to do. And a lot of stuff you are supposed to do. But the culture clash was the Jewish culture was much more conservative in interactions with other people. So men and women weren't allowed to interact together. Women and men were covered. The irony is the culture clash we see in the 21st century between conservative Muslims and Western culture. It's the same thing. They don't like us for running around with our belly buttons hanging out and piercings. They don't like us for our progressive sexual activities. They don't like us for, because they run around with their women in burqas. Well, the Jews were doing that 2,000 years ago. And Paul was seeing this culture. And he was a Christian, but he grew up as a student of the law. And so he really struggled with that. How do you move the Gentiles in, and do you make them Jews? And it didn't work ultimately, but that was where his conflict. And the letter of Romans is all about a conflict between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. And so he's trying to work them through that conflict, and he's trying to get them to behave and do the least amount of damage. And very similar in Corinthians, where he's struggling with their behaviors and that are drawing people away from the church, drawing them away from their relationship with God. So Did I explain the culture clash thing enough? The Jews and the Greeks weren't seeing eye to eye. 2,000 years later, homosexuality, we have really limited knowledge about how extensive it is in culture and society, because up until the 18th century, every bit of history that was written was about the rulers. He didn't write about average Joes, he wrote about the kings. They were the ones who counted. One of the rare examples of not doing that is the book of Ruth. Here's this common woman who makes it into the most important book in history. But other than that, history was about the kings and the rulers and all of their proclivities. And occasionally they would hint at someone having, and this it goes across cultures. Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Korean, and India, and both in the Hindu period and then later in the Muslim period when the rulers were there. There's always hints. But, there's a story of, what was his name, Edward the third, fourth king of England, and the assumption is he was gay. And his wife murdered him so she could put her lover on the throne. Well, we don't know. It doesn't say anywhere. It's all a lot of assumptions. It's been around. You assume it's been around. There's hints. In the 18th and 19th century, there would be clubs where gay men could gather and dance and carry on and those were all very closely hidden. It was against the law. So occasionally the police would raid one of them, arrest a bunch of people, haul them off, embarrass them publicly because you didn't want to be publicly acknowledged. Oscar Wilde is one of the famous ones. He was a great poet and author, and he was arrested for immoral conduct and put in prison. Then 1960s came, you were all there, having fun, causing trouble. Well, it changed the sexual mores for society, for the heterosexual community. Sexuality became much more out there, and you weren't hiding it anymore. Well, it also started in the gay culture. And in certain areas, New York City and San Francisco were areas where the community was gathering and being more out there. And I forget what year, there was an arrest of a bust on a gay club in San Francisco known as Stonewalls. And it created a riot. There was a pushback by the community, and there was riots, Stonewall riots. And that is seen as the turning point in the gay rights movement, and so they started to come out. The other place things are changing is in academia. As the 60s, as those rebels in college began to get into positions as professors, they were teaching progressive ideology and thought, and so where at one point you had to be an ordained clergy in order to be in a position of leadership in most religious or most higher education positions, not anymore. Now you weren't. You were one of the guys who was on the barricades in the 60s and 70s fighting against Vietnam, and now they're the teachers, and so they're teaching a very different culture in the academy, so wish I could read that. So, current clashes. We're seeing it all over the place. Part of this comes out of the election of Trump and a pushback against the progressive culture and more traditionalist culture, although Mr. Trump is not really much of a conservative. He's more of a traditionalist about his views about how America should be run. But that's politics aside. He's very effective at what he tries to do in stirring people up. And that stirring up has brought to the surface people saying, well, no. William Buckley said conservatism is standing athwart history and saying, stop. Trying to prevent this flow of destructive behavior as the conservatives see it. So we have seen in the last 30 years some real changes in the understandings and in the way things are presented and in the way things are supposedly accepted. All you have to do is turn on a television every show has, well, first it was a gay character, and then it was gay couples, and now it's trans couples, and every commercial has to check off boxes, and but that's all fairly new. But the movement has been going on for a while, and there is pushback. So we're in this kind of back and forth tension, and the pendulum swings, and it always does. And if you think you're winning, wait, because that's when the pendulum swings back the other way. That's the way society goes, and it has for a very long time. So right now we're swinging, and in churches especially, where we have what we perceive to be this duty to sexual morality, well, yeah, okay, so we're not going to allow anyone who's divorced and remarried in. That didn't garner your over-enthusiastic support. And so the church has been, and other denominations have already gone through this. When the prescriptions on ordination of homosexual clergy were there, well, there have been gay clergy forever. Sorry, they're out there. They just didn't, it was a don't ask, don't tell. When I started in seminary, we had a group for gay and lesbian clergy. They weren't officially recognized in 1986, but now they're a standard group. The world is changing. So the culture clash and the struggles and the changes and the pushback, what does it do to the United Methodist Church? We've seen other denominations go through this, the Lutherans, the Episcopals, and we didn't learn a thing. As I say, there have been gay clergy for generations, and it was always just kind of there. Well, and if you tried to bring someone up on charges, usually the bishops protected them and said, well, we're just going to, let this go. You got nothing, because it has to be self-avowed and practicing, and so it was impossible. Came to a head. Past 30 years, it's come to a head. The shift in leadership and education and the power centers. And power centers aren't the congregations anymore. There's a core of people who lead the conferences are chosen to do that, and they come out of certain backgrounds and structures. It's all very chosen and very well protected. So the power structures, just like in the education system, may not be reflecting the people in the pews, or all of them, but it's what they believe to be important. Education and the rise of the confessing movement. So conservative or traditionalist Methodists were looking at this shift to progressivism and going, no, we don't want that. We don't want that. We have the authority. We have the base. We don't want that at all. And so they formed the confessing movement. The other was the Wesleyan Covenant Society. Covenant. Anyway, they're the traditionalist group. And they've been pushing back and hard and organizing and hard in areas and in churches and trying to figure out what they can do. And they've been really effective. So the funny thing is, even as the shift moves in the leadership levels, they've been coming down to the grassroots levels and trying to get things to go their way. General Conference meets, and General Conference, as I've said, is the legislative body of the church, decides the rules, rewrites the rule books every 4 years. And they had one in 2020, 98, it's always in a presidential election year, so it would have been 2020. And because the African delegation was given full voting rights, suddenly what the progressives saw was a chance to eliminate those paragraphs on prescriptions on homosexuality. It was reaffirmed instead. And the progressives were really upset because they didn't get their way, and the conservatives or traditionalists are really upset because they were going to keep pushing, and it just started getting really ugly. Judicial Conference met a couple of years later. They meet in off years, and Judicial Conference's only job, and our Judicial Conference is everything from the Colorado border west. So all of Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, everything else, California, Alaska, and Tonga. Tongans are very good Methodists. And they elected at their meeting Bishop Karen Oliveto. She is a self-avowed practicing homosexual. She's married to another woman, comes from San Francisco, and, well, that just blew everything up. And they knew it would. Absolutely, you had to know it was not going to go down well. And there was a desire to try to respond to it, try to bring charges. Charges were largely dismissed based on the people bringing them didn't have standing. You had to be someone in her conference, and there was no one in our conference who was really ready to do that in any kind of meaningful way. And so Bishop Oliveto was consecrated, and she's been serving for the last 6 years. She actually does a better job than most bishops, but that's not a very high bar. The traditionalists' response was to try and get her removed, or to try to bring some kind of legislation to General Conference that would solve this. Well, COVID hit, and that stopped General Conference from happening. You couldn't travel. And then they put it off again another 2 years later, saying, well, we can't get the African delegates here, they can't travel. And then they put it off again till 2024. And the traditionalists basically had enough. And they said, we're going to form our own church, and we're just going to pull the plug. And so a year and a half ago, they formed the World Methodist Wrestling Federation. There was at one point a protocol of gracious separation, which was proposed by a group of moderates on both sides, and said, listen, if we're going to split up, let's find a way to do this and not embarrass ourselves before the world. And the more radicals on the other side said, no, we hate to be reasonable, let's be embarrassed. So the protocol never got approved because there was never a general conference to approve it. What had been approved before that was this paragraph 2553, known as the ugly divorce option. So any church that wants to leave the denomination, and you don't leave the denomination, you're a member of an annual conference, so you're all a member of the Mountain Sky Conference. If you wanted to leave the Mountain Sky Conference, you would have to have meetings, you would have to have a vote of the conference and active members. You can't just walk in and say you're going to vote. You have to, and it's a laborious process just to decide who can vote. And then it has to be a 66, 2/3% vote to leave. Then you have to come up with the current year's askings or apportionments, the next year's apportionments, any obligations you have to the pension system, and then they have like slush fund obscure numbers that they can throw at you. So my little church in Northeast Colorado that voted to leave had to pay $100,000 and some odd to keep their building. Yeah, and their budget's less than that on an annual basis. They managed to scrape together the money, and then there was all the other requirements for history and all this other stuff that little churches in the country don't keep. And it's like, we're just a church. We aren't a business. And it was very frustrating, and it just made them angrier and angrier as they went through the process, and more things were laid on them, and it made them more determined to leave rather than stay. It was, I mean, I don't agree with them leaving. I thought it was a bad idea. I don't think it will go well for them in the long run. But the church was determined to make it as difficult and as ugly as possible. The foundation of the Methodist Global Methodist Church. I just want to get a T-shirt that says World Methodist Wrestling Federation. The Global Methodists then offered support for churches, and they are an existing entity now. And if you get out of the United Methodist Church, you can join the Global Methodists. And people say, well, there's more of us than there are of them. Why did we have to leave? Well, no, there aren't. But they have and there's a lot of money, and there's a lot of power. And when there's power and money, people behave badly. Have down through history. We're not the first. We didn't invent it. But there's buildings, like there's a building in downtown Washington, D.C. that the United Methodist Church owns. That's worth $10 billion. It's ridiculous. They have assets all over the world. And then there's the pension fund, which is a ridiculously large clergy pension fund. Well, they worked out that one at least, so that if you served in the Methodist Church, but if you want to go to serve a Global Methodist Church, you have to turn in your credentials in the United Methodist Church, which means if this doesn't work, suddenly you're left hanging. You're no longer ordained. I worked really hard to get ordained. I ain't giving that up. Those lunatics. So we were left with the ugly divorce option, and that runs out this year. It was time limited. So after this year, they should have already had a general conference that set up a new set of rules for leaving. Well, they haven't had a general conference, there's no set of rules, so we don't know what's going to happen. And that made a bunch of people nervous about leaving and where they should go or where they could go, or just left people hanging out there. Are you terrified yet? You should be. Now what? Yeah. The loss of about 20% of congregations of the United Methodist Church. 6,000 some odd have disaffiliated in the last couple of years. We have about 30,000 congregations total. Most of them are in the southeast of the United States, but not all. Southeast tends to be much more socially conservative and religiously conservative in their approach. And so places like Georgia, entire conferences are leaving. And that's a real challenge. What it will look like in the long run and when there's a new set of rules, how many more churches will decide to go? I don't know. It'll settle out eventually. It has in every other denomination. It just leaves a bitter taste. As a child of divorce, to go through this, it just brings up all sorts of bad stuff for me. I'm sure it does for a lot of other people. You know, if you're a person who suffered through a really bitter and ugly divorce and you have to look at this, why would I go to church and relive the worst part of my life? I'll go somewhere else where they aren't fighting over this. General conference is scheduled now for April 2024. Without the delegates from the Global Methodist Church being there this time, it's very likely that the progressives will have a sufficient majority to wipe the slate clean on a bunch of issues, not only on homosexuality, but a bunch of other social issues, and they'll move forward on that over time. And the church will go more progressive, more liberal in its outlook and in its understandings, and the Global Methodists will hold to their traditionalist views. Community UMC. You want to start a fight over this? Not scared. It's like you say, it's a difficult issue. It brings up core concerns, especially if you're in the older generation and this was that awful thing, or if you've had some bad experience of this, then you may be inclined to say, no, homosexuality is bad. We can't do that. We can't do that at all. I understand that. It's a challenge. There's a lot of the rest of you who have nieces or children or grandchildren who've come out. And you say, well, geez, I got to love them anyway. Oh, God. That's a challenge. We're in challenging times. So as a church, if you really want to explore disaffiliation, the bishop will be so mad at me. That's all right. She's mad at me all the time. But we can do that. I wouldn't recommend it because it will leave you without a pastor. The Global Methodist Church isn't able to provide pastors, and you would be on your own hanging out there. And you have some very talented lay people here, but the advantage of ordained clergy is a big deal. But questions, concerns, fears, doubts? Yes, sir.
Do they still have the 10-year rule of the building?
Do
Does
they?
it become a church? Within that 10-year period that they disaffiliated.
Right. If you leave the denomination and you have 10 years, and if your church fails within those 10 years, the building reverts to the denomination. Yeah. So you lose both ways.
You know, what had me confused, and still has me a little confused, if you go back 4 years, it looked like the people that were going to disaffiliate were the progressive type people, the people that wanted to accept homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden now, we have a flip-flop.
Right.
And I don't fully understand that because from my background, and I don't really expect General Conference to do anything different than they've done before, because the Central Conference of the conferences outside the United States have such a big voice, and they are so conservative, and that's what has me confused.
I think actually the balance will tip, but that what's going to happen? Why is it that the traditionalists are leaving and the progressives are staying and keep ownership of the United Methodist name? Well, it's very likely that it will flip without the large percentage of American conservatives there. It was always a really razor-thin margin. And so without American traditionalists there, it's very likely to go progressive this time. So that's why. And they knew they had, like I say, you look at the numbers that are leaving, 20% are leaving. They're not, and 30% are, or whatever, 80% are staying. So they still are the majority.
Is that 20% of our churches or 20% of United Methodist membership?
20% of congregations. So that's 6,200 congregations have left. Yes, sir.
When a conference bishop is elected, is there a term limit?
When a conference bishop is elected, is there a term limit? Yes. They're appointed for a 4-year term, and usually after 4 terms, you know how presidents age? In a 4-year term, well, bishops do the same. It's a very hard job. And so they serve 4 years, and generally they serve another 2 years, and then if they still have time, they'll go to another conference for 4 years. But they retire, basically. You're a bishop for life, which is one of the sticking points with the Global Methodists. They don't think bishops for life is a good idea. Too high church. Yes.
To continue that thought then, so our bishop was elected in 2016 maybe?
Right. Yeah, well,
So if you add 4 and 2,
she could do,
6,
she,
instead of 2022,
she could do 2 full 4-year terms.
well, I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah. So, well, because the rules are pretty flexible. So, and they don't know what else to do with her. It's like bad clergy. They get sent to Utah.
So there kind of isn't a rule then. Is that what you said?
Well, the rule is you get a 4-year term. After 4 years, they evaluate the situation and say, do you want another 4 years? Do you want 2 years? Do you want to go somewhere else? And some bishops are there. But it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just tradition that they usually serve 6 years in the first place, 4 years in the second place, if they have time before retirement. You have to retire at 72, and most of them are done well before that.
So there is no
No hard and fast. Yeah.
term limit for our bishop.
No. Honestly, they could keep her around for longer if they really wanted to.
Okay, that's the answer.
Okay. I don't know as that'll happen, but I have no idea. Yes.
You have 20% of the congregations leaving. How many clergy are still in the United Methodist Church out of that 20%?
20% of the churches are leaving. How many clergy? What percentage of clergy? I don't have figures on that. I would imagine, again, in the Southeast, the clergy that are leaving tend to stay with their churches. And so it would be more, I know, in this conference, last year at annual conference, they voted 38 churches disaffiliated. Almost all of them small churches on the Eastern Plains or in San Luis Valley. And so, but very few clergy have left, just a handful. So it's going to be a challenge. The Methodist Church is short. This conference is short clergy right now. And it's going to be, what you're going to see is a return to lay leadership, local pastors, and circuit riding. So you're going to have a pastor serving 4 or 5 or more churches. So
United Methodist, Global Methodist, where does the phrase then or the term reconciling ministries?
so
Can you explain that?
where does reconciling congregations come in? Reconciling ministries or reconciling congregations came out of the late 80s, and it was an attempt for congregations to make a stand in favor of homosexuality, to say we support our gay brothers and gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. They're in full inclusion in the church. They won't be judged. They won't be thrown out. It's for membership, and obviously they support the ordination of gay clergy, but they don't have a say in that. So it's another long process. The church has to go through a year-long process of debate and discussion over whether or not you want to vote to become a reconciling congregation. And then if you do that, you put it out, and it just says you're welcome here.
So is it an official term within the United Methodist
No.
Church? Or did it,
No,
I've been to a reconciling ministry church in Colorado and then one in Chicago.
right.
So it's, and they call it, the church sign says United Methodist, but then when you.
Yeah, reconciling is just a designation that you're basically gay-friendly.
So that's the choice of that particular congregation.
Right. It's a congregational decision to add that to their terms.
They don't get in trouble for that. Does somebody come in and say, take that flag down?
No, not that I know of. Again, because of the leadership, the bishops are generally in support. So. Yes.
So Chuck and I moved here after we left Sunrise, after we left our church in Colorado Springs, they voted.
Right.
And then we got here and just, did our church get together and vote? Or did we just kind of, we were here. I don't know what this church did.
I don't believe you are a reconciling congregation.
Okay, so at this very minute, our book of discipline says, in those paragraphs you said before, no homosexual, not no, but no. That's the book of discipline that at this moment we,
That is the one that's enforced.
okay, so churches are just kind of ignoring it.
And have been for 30 years.
Okay,
It's like, the Roman Catholic Church. Scad's a gay priest. You gotta be kidding me. And you just don't ask. So, what else? Because we're almost done with time. I get a little nervous when people sneak up on me. Gotta use that microphone whether I want it or not, huh?
I just would like to continue that conversation. So when, to have this information laid out, thank you. And do we then, does someone say, well, it's time for us to make a decision or get together or open discussion? Or is this just information and we just go along being what we are? Or do we have a conversation that
We can
says,
certainly have some discussions around it. My suggestion, and it's just that a suggestion, would be wait until you get a new pastor, because they're going to have to be supportive of that process. And, I would be supportive of it, but I just don't want to lay it on someone else as a condition of their appointment here. And so my other suggestion is wait through General Conference of 2024, because it's going to change the landscape significantly. And after that, then we'll have a chance to see what's happening and what processes are there and then you can talk among yourselves and talk with your new pastor and go, out of the frying pan into the fire.
So if we don't make a decision by the end of 31 December, then we no longer can keep our building if we disaffiliate?
No, you just don't have a procedure for it anymore. So we don't know what it'll be. That procedure will have gone. Yeah, and I don't know. The obsession with keeping buildings has always confused me, but I guess we like this building. So,
Well, I was reading in the newspaper about a church, a big church in Oklahoma City, that decided to disaffiliate, and whatever the conference was in, they just kept throwing more things, requirements, and
right.
like you said, the ugly divorce.
Ugly divorce.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
I think they finally decided to go ahead with it, but
Well, and as you can imagine, our bishop isn't real thrilled about this. She takes it very personally, but has been pretty good about it. But there's other leadership that have been pretty not good about it. And so it's a challenge. I would, like I say, let's just ride it out, see where we are. Let's focus on growing the church and re-establishing our footing so we can go forward. And then, because something like that, you can lose a third of your congregation. And it's not to say we don't talk about it, but let's be respectful, let's be encouraging, and let's look to where we go in the future. And then when we're solid enough to make decisions, we can do that. I don't know. All right, we're to time.
Pastor,
Yeah.
since I have the microphone, we are.
Go ahead.
We all want to thank you, Pastor Paul, for bringing this up. I'm not aware of anybody else bringing this up in our congregation, but I also have to say, I don't know what to do next. So, but thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah. Well, it's the advantage of being short-term. Honestly, I've gone through my 35-year career, and if you ask most of the people in my churches what my political affiliation is, they'd say, oh, he agrees with me. Because it's not my job to change your politics, it's my job to change your heart and your spirit. And if that changes things in your life, that's great. But yeah, how to fix your car. I don't think there's any more. Yay. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to the tech guys for staying. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Yeah.